The morning train let her off at a town so small it seemed to apologize for itself. A single street of false-fronted buildings standing against a sky that went on without permission in every direction. She was the last to step down. A man with a sample case had pushed ahead of her at Brandon and stayed ahead the whole way. And a young mother with 2 children had gathered them like loose washing the moment the brakes took hold. So by the time she set her boot on the iron step, the platform had nearly emptied. She did not hurry. She had learned a long time ago that hurrying only told people things about you that you would rather keep. She stood a moment with her case against her leg and looked the place over the way she looked at everything now, taking inventory. One street. A general store with a porch-worn pail where boots had scraped it. A livery. A hotel that was really a boarding house with ambitions. A church at the far end no bigger than a schoolroom. And across the tracks a grain elevator the color of dried blood with the railway's name painted up its side. Beyond the last buildings, the prairie took over and did not stop. There was a slough off to the south, catching the light flat and gray, and a bluff of poplars past it, bent all one way by a wind that was not blowing now but clearly had opinions. In her coat pocket, she had a square of paper folded so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth. On it was an address and a few lines copied out of a notice she had read in a Winnipeg paper, the kind of notice a person answered only when the alternative was worse. A man wanted a woman to keep his house. He paid a fair wage. A room came with it. He had not said he was kind, or lonely, or looking for anything beyond the work, and that plainness was the thing that had decided her. She had had enough of men who promised. She trusted a man who only stated terms. She knew already that by supper her face would be known. Town this size kept no secrets, and a strange woman off the morning train was the most interesting thing that would happen to it all week. A girl of about 10 sat on the livery rail swinging her heels and frankly staring. 2 old men on the store porch had stopped their talk when the train came in and not started it again. A woman in a gray shawl watched from the post office door without pretending otherwise. She let them look. There was nothing about her worth the trouble of looking, and they would find that out soon enough and lose interest, and that suited her. The store was the sensible first stop. The bell over the door announced her, and a man behind the counter looked up from a ledger, older, with reading glasses pushed down his nose and the patient face of someone who had watched the whole population of the district come through that door at one time or another. "Help you, miss? I'm looking for the Wheelwright," she said. "I have an address. I can't make out the road." He set down his pen. "That'd be the shop 2 doors up, this side. But if you're after the man himself this hour, he'll be out at his place. 1.25 miles west on the section road, north side, you'll see the poplars." He looked at her over the glasses, not unkindly. You'd be the one he was expecting. She had not said so. "Yes," she said. He nodded once, the way a man nods when something he had heard turns out to be true. "Halloran," he said, and put out his hand, and she shook it because there was no graceful way not to. "He's a good worker. Quiet." He seemed about to add something and decided against it, and she was grateful because she had spent her life being told things about people by other people and had found almost none of it useful. She bought a paper of pins she did not need to be a customer and not only a question, and asked if anyone might be going west who could carry her. And Halloran said the man himself was due in by noon for a tire he was setting, and she could wait or walk, and that the walk would do her no harm if her case was light. Her case was not light, but she said she would walk a ways and meet the road, and step back out into a wind that had decided to start after all. She did not have to walk far. She had gone perhaps 1/4 mile past the elevator, the town already thinning behind her into stubble and fence line, when she heard a wagon coming up easy behind her, the dry creak of it, and the soft, enormous patience of a team in no hurry. She moved to the edge of the road and did not turn, and the wagon slowed and stopped, and she turned then because it would have been strange not to. He looked older than she had built him in her mind from a notice and a single letter. Not old. Weathered in the particular way of men who worked outdoors and indoors both, sun on the back of his neck and forge heat on the front of him. He had a wheelwright's hands broad across the knuckle, a burn shining old and pale along one forearm. His eyes were a plain gray, and they went over her once, her case, her boots, her face, not rude about it, only thorough, The way he would look at a wheel someone had brought him to mend, deciding what it would need. "You'll be off the morning train," he said. It was not a question, so she did not answer it as one. "I am," she said. He looked at her a moment longer. Then he leaned and took her case from her hand, swung it up into the box behind him as though it weighed nothing, and moved over on the seat. "Long walk in this wind," he said, which she understood to be an invitation, and she climbed up beside him, and he clicked to the team, and they went on west. For a mile he said nothing, and neither did she, and she decided she could live with a man like that. The road ran straight as a ruled line. To either side the wheat stood in stook, the cut fields gone gold, and the uncut still standing greenish gold and rolling when the wind walked across it. A hawk hung over the slough, doing nothing in particular. She watched the country the way she watched everything, filing it, the poplars all leaning, the fence wire singing low, a single far-off house with smoke standing up off the chimney and then bending. She had a habit, old as her hands, of breaking the world down into lines and weights, the way another woman might hum. Somewhere under her ribs a part of her that had been clenched a long time eased by a single notch, and she did not trust it, and she let it ease anyway. "There," he said, and lifted his chin. The poplars came up on the right, a tight bluff of them sheltering a low house, and, behind it, a stable and a small board barn, and a yard hard-packed and swept. It was a homestead like 100 others she had passed, and at the same time it was not, because everything in it had been kept. The fences were tight, the woodpile was squared and roofed against snow. The well had a proper cover. A man who let nothing fall apart lived here, and she understood already that this was the whole of him, that he mended the world because he could not abide a thing left broken. He pulled the team up by the house and got down and took her case again before she could reach for it. A dog came out from under the porch to meet him, a rangy black and white thing with one ear that would not stand, and pressed itself against his leg and looked up at her with the open suspicion of an animal whose loyalties were entirely decided. "Scout," the man said, to the dog. Not to her, and the dog sat. To her he said, "He'll come round or he won't. Suit himself." Inside, the house told her more in 1 minute than the man had in a mile. It was clean in the way a carpenter keeps a place when there is no one to keep it for, which is to say swept but not warmed, every surface bare. A stove, blacked, table with 2 chairs and one of them clearly never used, pushed in square, a shelf of crockery. On the wall, a calendar 2 years old that he had stopped tearing the leaves from, and beside the inner door, lo, a row of pegs at a child's height that no child used. And she looked at those once, and then did not look at them again, because she had learned that a house will tell you its griefs if you let it, and that it was not her place yet to know them. He showed her the room off the kitchen, narrow, a bed, a window facing the bluff. He set her case down inside the door. "Wages first of the month," he said. "Wood split, I'll keep it split. You'll find the cellars stocked. Anything you want from town, you make a list. I go Saturdays." He paused as if running down a list of his own. "I'm out in the shop most days. House is yours to run. I don't ask after it." "All right," she said. He looked at her then with something she could not name, there and gone. "You came a long way for the work," he said. "I came a long way to be somewhere," she said, before she had decided to, and his eyes changed by a fraction, and he nodded once and went out to set his tire, and the dog went with him, and she stood in the cold, clean kitchen of a stranger, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could say, that no one in the world knew precisely where she was, and that this was not loneliness, it was rest. She unpacked what little she had, a second dress, a comb, a flat tin of pencils worn to stubs, and a drawing book gone soft at the corners, and near full the last few pages the only blank ones left in the world that belonged to her. She had carried that book through 3 provinces, and 1 bad year she did not draw at all. She set it on the windowsill where the light off the bluff would fall on it in the morning, and stood looking at it a moment. And then she went and found the stove and the stove wood and the flour. And she began, because work was the one prayer she still trusted. And the man would come in at dark to a warm house whether he asked after it or not. The first weeks went by the way she had hoped, which is to say almost without event. She learned the house and then the yard and then the rhythm of him. He rose before her and lit the stove though it was her work, and she let him, because she came to understand it was not a correction but a habit older than her arrival, a thing he did the way the dog circled before it lay down. He ate what she cooked without comment, which she learned to read as approval, since a man who minded would have said so. He came in at noon and at dark, washed at the basin by the door, sat at the used chair. They did not talk much, and what talking there was had the shape of weather and work. The price of wheat, a wheel a man had brought in cracked clean through the felloe. The first hard frost that took her garden in a single night. She watched him the way she watched everything. She noticed he favored the left hand for fine work and the right for force. She noticed he could not pass a sagging gate without setting it right, and that he talked to the team in a low, steady murmur he did not know carried, and that he never once in those weeks sat in the unused chair or moved the child high pegs by the door. She noticed that he was a man living carefully inside a grief he had folded up small and put away, the way you fold a thing you cannot bear to look at, but cannot bring yourself to burn. She did not ask. She had her own folded thing, smaller than his, she thought, or only newer, and she had no wish to trade. The town came to know her by degrees. On the second Saturday, she rode in with him and stood in Halloran's store, choosing thread and lamp oil, while two women she did not know watched her over the dry goods and discussed her in the carrying whisper people use when they want to be heard. She kept her face smooth. A woman in a gray shawl, the same who had watched from the post office, came round the end of the counter and introduced herself as Mrs. Dewar, who farmed the next quarter east, and looked her up and down with an interest that was not unfriendly so much as starved. "You're keeping for him, then," Mrs. Dewar said. "I am. Good." The woman lowered her voice, but not enough. "He's not had it easy. Lost the both of them inside a week. The fever. 4 winters back now. The wife and the little one." She shook her head. "Hardly speaks since. Kept the place up like she might walk back into it." She looked sideways. "You'll find him decent. He's just a man who's forgotten how to want anything." She said nothing to that, only thanked the woman for the kindness of telling her, which was the polite shape to put around a thing she had not asked to know. But it sat with her on the ride home, the gray country going past, and she found she could not put it down. The wife and the little one, the pegs at the door, the chair pushed square. A man who mended every broken thing within reach, because the one thing he could not mend had broken him, and who had answered the impossibility of an empty house, not with a wife but with a notice, with terms, with a stranger who asked nothing, and offered nothing, and could be borne. She understood then why the plainness of his letter had drawn her. They were the same kind of careful. They had both decided that wanting was a thing that cost too much. The first real snow came in November, early even for the country, a wet, blinding fall that started in the afternoon, and by dark had turned the yard to a white smother with the bluff gone to ghosts. He had gone out after dinner to the shop in town, a rush job, an axle for a freighter who needed it by morning, and he had said he would be back by dark, and dark had come and gone. She kept his supper warm and then warmer, and then took it off the heat. She told herself 100 sensible things. The team knew the road, he knew the country blind. Men were late, and under the sensible things ran a thinner, older voice she knew far too well. The voice that had been right once before, the voice that said this is how it begins, the waiting, and then the not coming, and then the rest of your life. She had buried a man before. She did not let herself think the word, but her hands knew it, going cold at the wrists. When she could not stand the kitchen any longer, she put on his second coat, which was the warmest thing in the house, and lit the storm lantern and went out to the end of the yard, where the lane met the section road, the dog pressed against her leg, whining low, and she stood in the wind with the snow coming sideways into the lamp, and she could see perhaps 30 feet of nothing. She did not pray, having lost the habit, but she stood in a way that was very like it. And then the dog's whole body changed, went rigid and then loose, and then it broke from her and was gone into the white, and a long moment later, out of the dark where the road should be, came the slow shape of the team, heads down, rimed white, and the man hunched on the box with his collar up and his hat gone and his hair stiff with snow, and the dog leaping at the horses' heads to bring them in. She did not say anything when he got down. There was nothing she could have said that would not have given too much away. She held the lantern while he put the team up and rubbed them down, his hands clumsy with cold, and she did not offer to help because he would not have allowed it. And when he was done, they went in together, and she put his supper back on the stove, and he sat in the used chair, with his hands wrapped round a cup, shaking a little, not looking at her. "You waited up," he said. Not a question again. "Stove needed minding," she said. He looked at the lantern still in her hand, still lit, that she had carried to the end of the lane and forgotten to put down. He looked at his own second coat on her shoulders. He did not say anything about either. But something passed over his face, the careful folded thing shifting just slightly the way a banked fire shifts when the draft changes, and he said low, "Wouldn't want to put you out. Coming all this way to keep house for a man froze in a ditch." It was, she realized after a startled second, a joke, the first he had made. She felt her own mouth move before she could decide whether to allow it. "It would have been very inconvenient," she said. "I'd only just got the cellar the way I like it." And he laughed. It came out of him rough and surprised, like a hinge that had not turned in years, and the dog lifted its head, and outside the snow came down and buried the tracks of his near miss, and something in the house, some held breath it had been holding for 4 winters, let go. After the storm things were different, and neither of them spoke of it. The difference was in small things, which were the only things either of them trusted. He began to come in at noon and stay a quarter hour longer than the meal required, sitting with his cup telling her, in his spare way, about the work. A wheel was a thing under tension everywhere at once, he told her. The felloes pushing out, and the spokes pushing in, and the iron tire holding the whole quarrel together. And a good wheel was not one without strain, but one where the strains were balanced so true you'd never know they were fighting. She thought that was the longest he had ever spoken, and that he had not, perhaps, been talking only about wheels. She had taken up the drawing book again. She had not meant to. It had sat on the windowsill all those weeks like a door she would not open. And then one gray afternoon with the bread rising, and nothing else demanding her, she had taken a stub of pencil and drawn the dog asleep by the stove, because it was there, and because her hand wanted to, and the wanting had felt dangerous and then merely good. After that, she drew most days in the spare hour, small things, the crockery on the shelf, the bluff in its first snow, the team. She kept the book on the sill and did not hide it, but she did not show it either, and she did not draw him, though her eye went over him the way her eye went over everything now, measuring, because to draw him would have been to admit she had been looking. She thought he did not notice the book. She was wrong about that, as she learned the way she learned everything about him, by the evidence of small accumulating facts. It began with the pencils. She came in from the line one cold afternoon, and there on the sill beside her book lay 3 new pencils. Good ones, hard graphite, the kind a person had to send to Winnipeg for, squared off neat as if they had been measured. She stood and looked at them a long time. She did not ask, he did not mention them. At supper she watched him, and he ate and looked at his plate and gave her nothing. And she understood that she was meant to give him nothing back, that this was the only kind of speech the two of them could afford. And she put the pencils in her tin without a word, and the next day she used one and said nothing, and saw, when she said nothing, the corner of his mouth move and go still. Then it was paper. She had been drawing small to spare the last pages, and a week on she found, set on the sill, a small book he had made himself. She could see that at once, the cover cut from a Wheelwright stiff card, and the pages good rag paper trimmed even and sewn through the fold with waxed thread. The binding tight and true, the way everything he made was true. It held more blank pages than her old book had ever had. He had built her somewhere to put the looking. She sat down on the edge of her narrow bed with the made book in her hands, and she did not cry, having mostly forgotten how, but she came nearer to it than she had in 4 years. And she understood with a kind of falling clarity that she had not been chosen carelessly. A man who paid attention to wheels paid attention to people. He had read the notice she was, the way she had read his, plainly, no flattery. And he had seen under the plain words a woman who needed somewhere to put what she could not say. And he had built it for her with his hands and set it on the sill and walked away and said nothing, because saying nothing was the most he could trust himself to risk. She began after that to leave the bluff and draw the yard, the shop in town, the things that were his. She drew the team and left it on the table by accident on purpose, and found it the next day moved, set up on the shelf against the crockery where the light caught it. He never said. She never asked. But she began to find feathers on the sill. A hawk's banded wing feather, A grouse's, once a whole small abandoned nest set there with the care of a man handling something that might break, things he had found in the country and carried home in his coat for her to look at and put down on paper. And she drew everyone, and the maid book filled, and the house warmed by a degree she could measure and a degree she could not. She was happy. She knew enough to be afraid of the word, and she used it anyway, in the privacy of her own skull. She had not expected it again. She had come to keep a house and be somewhere. And she had wakened one morning to find that the somewhere had become a home while she was looking the other way, and that the careful man in the shop had become a thing her eye sought out across a yard, that she watched for at noon, that she drew now in the margins of the maid book when he was not there, the line of his back at the bench, the shape of his hands. She knew it could not stay unspoken forever, and she did not know which of them would speak first, or whether it would be spoken at all, or whether they would simply go on this way, two careful people leaving each other small true things on a windowsill until they were old. She found she could have borne even that. After the year she had had, even the unspoken version was more than she had thought the world still owed her. The hard snow came for good the last week of November. She woke one morning to the particular silence that meant the wind had dropped in the night, and the valley had pulled its collar up, and the light through the curtain had gone to that flat white that has no hour in it. And she knew before she rose that the country was buried. She dressed in the cold and went out to the kitchen and found the stove already lit, the coffee already made, and the man not in it. She stood at the window with her cup and watched him cross the yard through the falling snow toward the shop. He kept out back for winter work, his collar up, his head down, unhurried, and she could see his tracks already half filled, going and coming and going again. Which meant he had been up and out a long while, doing the chores in the dark so she would not have to wake to a cold house. The dog walked at his heel, and the smoke began to stand up off the small shop chimney and bend. On the table that morning she had left the drawing. She had done it the night before, after he had gone to his room by lamplight on the last good page of the maid book, and she had worked at it longer than she had worked at anything, and she had got it. Finally, the way you get a wheel true, when all the strains come into balance and stop fighting. It was him, the line of his back at the bench and the lamp at his shoulder and his hands at the fine work. And behind him, where she had set them in because they belonged there and not because she had decided to forgive him for them. The row of low pegs by the door, and on the nearest peg, drawn small and exact, the dog's worn collar she had hung there herself one night without thinking, so that the pegs that had held nothing for 4 winters held something now. She had not signed it, she did not need to. He would know whose hand it was the way she knew his. She had torn it carefully from the maid book and set it on the table by his place, face up, and gone to bed, not knowing if she had the courage, and finding in the morning that the courage had been the leaving of it, and that the rest was his. She watched him come back across the yard when the light had gone full and white. He knocked the snow from his boots at the door and came in and poured himself coffee and stood at the far end of the counter the way he always stood, close enough to share the room, far enough to make no claim. The drawing lay on the table between them. She did not look at it, and she did not look at him, and she felt every line of it across the room like a hand held out. He set his cup down. She heard him pick the paper up. She heard the particular quality of the silence of a man looking at a thing for a long time. She made herself busy at the stove and did not turn. "That left peg," he said at last, and his voice was not quite his own. "You've got it leaning." She turned then. He was holding the drawing in both hands the way he held things that might break, and he was not looking at her. He was looking at the paper, and his jaw was working in a way that had nothing to do with words. "It does lean," she said. "I draw what's there." He was quiet a moment. "I'll fix it," he said. "The peg." And she understood that he was not, in fact, talking about the peg, and that this was the largest thing he knew how to say, and she let it be large enough. He crossed the room. He did not reach for her, and she did not reach for him. Not yet. That would come in its own slow, true time, the way everything between them came. He set the drawing up on the shelf against the crockery, where the team was, where the light fell, where a man could see it from his chair, and he stood looking at it with her beside him. The two of them careful and close, and outside the snow came down steady and unhurried the way it would come for months, filling the yard, evening the tracks, making the whole country new. She did not look at the windowsill, but she knew without looking that the made book was there, and the feathers, and the nest, and the new pencils, and that they would stay, and that she had stopped, somewhere in the buried weeks, waiting for the worst to come, and started to live in the house as though it were hers, because it was, and as though she had been chosen, because she had, plainly, the way she would have wanted it, with no flattery and no promises. Only a man who built a thing, and set it where the light could find it, and walked away and let her see for herself what it was worth.